Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Dr. Catherine Wu. I'm a lecturer at the Nanyang Business School on Cultural Intelligence, where I teach global leadership and cultural intelligence in the Nanyang Fellows and Nanyang MBA programs. And I'm also the executive program director for the Center for Leadership and Cultural Intelligence at NTU here in Singapore. So did you know that by some account, up to 70% of international ventures fail due to cultural differences? The numbers vary, but there is an agreement that cultural differences are a potential source of challenges for businesses, especially expanding in international arena. And so this brings an important question, which is, what is the difference between individuals, teams, and organizations that are successful at crossing cultures and those that are not? So one quality that we know is necessary or is very useful for individuals, teams, and organizations to succeed across culture is cultural intelligence. It's a set of motivations, awareness, and skills that people, individuals, teams, and organizations have that operate successfully in culturally diverse environments. The work on cultural intelligence was started actually in Singapore at the Nanyang Business School by Professor Christopher Early and Professor Soon Ang with their 2003 book on cultural intelligence. And this work led to the creation of the world's first cultural intelligence center here at the Nanyang Business School, again, which has a mission to lead in the development of knowledge, assessments, and programs on cultural intelligence. So to date, the research on cultural intelligence has been conducted in more than 160 countries all around the world. And this is something that is important to note because it shows that these qualities of cultural intelligence are not specific to any culture, but they are more general competence, specific competence that anyone can develop and grow irrespective of the culture or the background in which we are immersed in. And there is wide-scale agreement as well of the return on investment of cultural intelligence. Today, there are more than 1,700 studies conducted and that have demonstrated that individuals, teams, and organizations that nurture these qualities of cultural intelligence do better in a number of areas, including performance, leadership, adaptability, and many other qualities. Now, one thing to understand about cultural intelligence is that it shifts the focus. So previously, when we spoke about training about culture and adaptation to different cultures, most of the focus was on comparing cultures. So the French are like this, the Singaporeans are like that. Here is how you do business with the Chinese or the Germans. And cultural intelligence shifts that focus to the idea of building capabilities. So the question here is, what do we need to learn in order to adapt to diverse environments? And the diversity can be both external, expanding globally or dealing with stakeholders from different backgrounds, but also internal. How do we also deal with the diversity that we can see internally in our organizations? So specifically, cultural intelligence suggests that leaders, teams, and organizations that have cultural intelligence demonstrate 4 qualities, what we call 4 factors. The first one is the drive. The drive is a curiosity and to engage with culturally diverse stakeholders, employees, business partners, and customers. The second one is a knowledge. Is having the complex and nuanced knowledge structures of how things are done in other cultures, being able to recognize the similarities and the differences. The third one is what we call the strategy, is the conscious awareness, consciously thinking of the effect of culture on individual and group dynamics, how these groups relate to one another, and then being able to plan with the idea of culture, with planning with culture in mind. And the fourth qualities of culturally intelligent individuals, teams, and organizations is the flexibility to change and adapt behaviors, policies, practices, so that they can be appropriate in different contexts and in multicultural contexts. So today we have the great pleasure to meet with 3 senior industry experts that are here to discuss the importance of cultural intelligence for organizations. We have Preet Grewal, who is the Inclusion and Diversity Head, JPAC for Twitter. We have Dhruv Mehra, who is a partner and a Mercer's M&A Advisory Service Leader for the Asia, Middle East, Africa region. And then we have Professor Guido Genasso, who is a professor of leadership at HEC Paris in Qatar, Doha campus, and who is also a former professor at NBS, Nanyang Business School, and culturally intelligence expert and LinkedIn influencer. So all 3 of them are here to share their own perspective of how in their own business and professional context, their own reflection on cultural intelligence. They will first share brief presentation about their work and personal reflections. And then after that, we will open the floor for questions. I would like to invite everyone at any point in time to share your questions in the chat. You can type them in. And then we will get back to the question later on in the second part of the webinar during the Q&A. Okay, so our first speaker today will be Preet Grewal. So I will give you first a brief introduction or some introduction of Preet. So Preet is an experienced I&D leader, and she has worked for more than 18 years. She's driven in HR, she is driven by her passion, and she takes pride in work to create inclusive work cultures where everyone can belong and thrive. As the I&D head for JPAC at Twitter, Preet leads internal I&D programs, training and engagement to advance global goals and regional growth of Twitter's business resource groups. Preet is a trusted advisor to her stakeholders and lead with principles of respect and empathy to influence corporate culture change. Preet has lived in India, UK, and Canada, and she moved in Singapore with her family in 2016. Today, she will share with us about her experience leading I&D initiatives at Twitter in Southeast Asia. So let's all welcome Preet. Preet Grewal.
Thank you, Catherine. Can you see my screen come in?
Very well. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for hosting me, and I'm really excited to be here and really also learn a lot from our other speakers today. So really happy to be here. So as you heard Catherine say, I am Preet Grewal. My pronouns are she, her. I was born and raised for my initial years in both India and the UK. And then my family permanently immigrated to Canada when I was 15, and Toronto, Canada is where I call home. So I started my career in HR. It's actually now been exactly 20 years. I'm getting my 20-year university graduation reunion calls. And I've been doing I&D specific work now for the last 12 years or so of my career, first in Canada and then more since 2016, since I moved to Singapore. So I've been at Twitter now since January of 2020, so just before the pandemic lockdown really started. And I have really just seen Twitter through the eyes of the pandemic and Twitter being the company that we are. So I'm happy to share a little bit around who we are as a company, what our inclusion and diversity vision and goals are. And I really want to then highlight how we talk about cultural intelligence in our corporate setting. So I'm guessing you must have heard about what Twitter is or who Twitter is by now. We are currently dominating a little bit of the news cycle. I think something happened last night, but really happy to share a little bit around the work that our team does, in particular around inclusion, diversity, accessibility, and equity. That's the team that I'm part of. So at Twitter, our vision really is that we want to be the most inclusive, diverse, accessible, and equitable tech company. We believe that is how we will serve the global public conversation on the platform. To build a platform where so many marginalized communities and groups and individuals find their voice and voice their opinions, we need to have an understanding within the company of the unique challenges that these groups face, and then really being a representation of the communities and creating an environment where they can actually thrive in the company and on the platform. As far as the business case for inclusion and diversity goes, I think that, to be honest, is quite clear. I think research has been very strong in that space, that companies that are culturally diverse perform better. Companies that have gender balance at the leadership level and throughout the company outperform and are perceived in a much more positive light. The people case highlights that when you have employees that feel respected, valued, and know that they are being treated fairly, they do better, they stay longer, they create a real positive environment for everyone. So inclusion and diversity work is really embedded for us in who we are as a company. A couple of our goals, and we've been very vocal about them. There's a lot of information that we share quarterly and annually. We want to be a company where, particularly for the representation of women in tech, which we know lags for us as an industry, we want to plug that gap a little bit. So we have a goal that we want to be 50% women by the year 2025. And actually our most recent numbers and report that we just put out shows we're probably going to hit that mark by the end of this year. So we're ahead of our goals a little bit. In regards to cultural diversity goals, because we are a US-based company, we have called out some race and ethnicity goals that we want to meet in the US, particularly that 25% of our employees should reflect the Black, Latinx, and the indigenous populations of the US. And we share those metrics as well quite openly. But here in JPAC, outside of the US largely, we don't necessarily have ethnicity or race goals defined just yet, but this is an area that we want to move to. We've identified that across the world, the most underrepresented communities are often women, people with disabilities, people from the LGBTQ community, and people who face marginalization based on race and ethnic identity. These are also the communities that are most often impacted by bias, by stereotypes, by microaggressions in the workplace as well. JPAC, our region, is no different. It's very complex, it's very diverse. So we start defining race and ethnicity and that cultural diversity at a much more local level. So for example, India is a key market for us, and we know racism in India often manifests itself against oppressed caste communities or on the basis of religion or towards regional or language communities within the country. Similarly, for Australia, the indigenous experience for Australians, it's different as well. They experience a much stronger wage gap. It's almost close to 60% compared to non-indigenous populations. So really defining that cultural diversity is really done at a much more local level, but we really center our inclusion and diversity conversations around these 4 key demographics for us in the region. So just for everyone's awareness. And really, how do we do it? How do we do the work around inclusion and diversity? So these are some key principles for us that we strive by. Transparency and accountability for us, really coming from the top, is quite important. So ensuring that leaders are constantly engaged, and we're always being very transparent with our workforce on what we're doing, what's our goal, how are we progressing towards it, and all of our metrics and reporting really goes towards that. We believe in making an intentional effort in our recruiting process. So for example, anyone that touches recruiting at Twitter needs to complete trainings around bias, training around what are really some inclusive principles when it comes to hiring. We're holding teams accountable for delivering those principles as well. So we have a metric where before a hire is made, the recruiting teams and the hiring manager has to ensure that one of the last 3 candidates being reviewed is a woman. And in the US particularly, one of the last 3 candidates has to represent either the Black or the Latinx community as well. We're really embedding I&D into the business. So just because my team's title or my title has inclusion and diversity in it doesn't mean that we're the only ones that are responsible. So really, embedding that into the very core of our business itself. So we're an engineering company, so we want to build products for the platform with accessibility in mind, for example. Bias in AI is a huge conversation as well. So we want to make sure that these are the metrics and conversations that are being embedded into the business. Inclusive marketing principles when we're talking to our customers as well. And lastly, really just driving a culture of inclusion across the company. And this can come through our employee resource groups or business resource groups, or BRGs as we call them, through structured and unstructured learning, and just really creating space for this conversation to take place at Twitter. So I'm going to double click a little bit on specifically building cultural intelligence. And I was sharing with Catherine as well when she approached me. And I think it's fundamentally part of creating an inclusive environment where everyone is welcome. So championing a workplace where, there is, at the end of the day, the principles of, respect and fairness, as I've mentioned, that are absolutely embedded in everything that we do. So a couple of areas that I really want to share would be, a key focus would be, how do you deliver or how do you create space for everyone to learn about these concepts? I think we cannot assume that just because somebody is working at Twitter that they automatically understand what bias looks like towards different communities, that they automatically understand how we stereotype or what microaggressions might look like. So a key area that my team focuses on is delivering dedicated trainings and creating an environment where learning is really encouraged. We have a framework of allyship at Twitter, and learn is the very first principle of that framework. So really recognizing that we need to provide our employees, our tweets, with the tools and resources to drive inclusion at the individual level. So some key concepts that we talk about in our trainings is about microaggressions, bias, how words that we use every day matter, and how you can really foster allyship. The goal for these trainings is to really build a community, as I said, to learn about the principles of empathy, to learn that I should take a pause and be able to identify that perhaps as I'm about to make a key decision for my team, that there could be some bias at play in my mind. Is there something that I need to be aware of? Am I stereotyping based on what my own unconscious bias might be about someone's cultural identity? So really, creating that common language, common understanding that some big programs are absolutely necessary, but really at the individual level, we need to understand how these concepts play a role when we're interacting with each other. So this structured learning, I think, is a key component for what we do. Another unstructured component of training could come from our BRG. So really inviting thought leaders from different communities, inviting them in to share their lived experience. I might not know what the lived experience has been for someone who comes from a different cultural background than I do. So the company taking the time to create that space for that learning to happen, we can learn, we can share that this is why, these words matter to my community. This is why this is hate speech, and this, this is how it's perceived. So we create those opportunities for learning, and that's a good step for us. The other area that I really want to highlight would be some practices that we're doubling down on around talent development and talent management with that cultural intelligence background in mind. So for example, in inclusive leadership, when we work with our managers and leaders, we talk about having conversations about leveraging the cross-cultural diversity of their teams and really building a healthy environment so people from different cultures can survive and thrive, really. So there's guidance that we provide leaders on cross-cultural communication. We use a tool called GlobeSmart from the Aperian Global family. And we use that in our manager conversation sessions to say, just to get a sense of how different cultures might have communication at play. So that's built into our manager trainings. We talk a lot about psychological safety and how teams can really foster psychological safety. And generally speaking, people coming from different cultural backgrounds in a mix potentially have a higher chance of not finding that psychological safety unless there is intentional effort being done to make that happen. We talk about day-to-day activities, like how do you work with people across different time zones? How do you work across global teams if you are part of a global project? And how can you be more empathetic around events that are happening around the world so you are aware and you should know what might be impacting someone that is coming to your team that day. So really, as a US-centric company, a lot of this effort has been to raise the awareness of how do we become more global in nature. But I think that element of cross-cultural intelligence building is built into that work that we do. And the last aspect that I want to speak to would be building cultural intelligence into the practice of talent management. So really looking at the processes we have around talent development and promotions. And I think in this part of the world, a very pertinent topic coming up is really even how do we define leadership and ensuring that we're not using a very white, Western, male-centric definition of leadership, especially when it comes to what we think are aspects that keep women back, or what do we think are aspects that's keeping talent from Asia back in leadership roles. So it's really about that discussion of, are we defining leadership based on competencies, or once again falling into that stereotypical trope of what a leader is based on what historically has been defined as the male white centric mode. So really building equitable programs around leaders, developing leaders, once again, coming away from that US centricity, when sometimes people say, oh, I'm not sure if this person wants to be in a leadership role, I don't see them speaking up in meetings. So really educating at that point in the moment, and also building programming around it to say, what necessary interventions are to be made here so people feel comfortable speaking up, so that speaking up is by itself not seen as a leadership quality that is necessary, but rather what else could be at play. Another example I could give here would be even looking at our leadership programs for women in Japan in particular, a market that we know historically has not been as conducive for women to grow into leadership roles. And once again, going into that and seeing what might be cross-culturally relevant conversations that we need to have. What is the local current conversation that women are having amongst each other about what is holding them back in leadership, and using that and leveraging those very dialogues in the development programs that we're creating as well. So all of this, I think, is underlined and underpinned by the idea that we do want to be a very culturally intelligent company. I think it's absolutely necessary as you grow into new markets, and as you think about diversifying your leadership base, even for an MNC like ourselves. So this is what I would say is some of the areas that Twitter is focused on. I'm going to stop sharing and then just pass the mic back to Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Preet, for this sharing. So I will move on to our next speaker, Dhruv. Dhruv Mehra. So Dhruv Mehra is based in Singapore right now. He's a partner and a merger and acquisition advisory service leader for Mercer. He also leads the multinational client segment for Singapore. He has about 20 years of human capital consulting experience and has worked on a broad range of assignments, including cross-border M&A due diligence, Dubai close and post-close support for merger, joint ventures, spin-off, carve-outs, and reorganizations. So his key expertise is on M&A transactions, HR due diligence for complex cross-border and multi-country transactions. Today, Dhruv is here to speak with us about the cultural risk in a merger and acquisition through specific examples from the region and his experience in Southeast Asia. And he will also share some latest research conducted by Mercer in Asia. Let's welcome Dhruv Mehra.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully this works. There you go. Great. So, culture is a topic that's close to my heart. It's one that I find super interesting, and the way I've experienced culture both in my own professional career as well as through the lens of my advisory role, where I frequently advise C-suite and large organizations on M&A transactions. So very, very happy to be part of this panel today and share some of my perspectives. I'd actually like to start with a quote, right? And this is one that really resonates with me. If you do not manage culture, it manages you. And you may not even be aware of the extent to which this is happening. This is by the famous organizational development professor Edgar Schein. And I find this has been very, very true, in my experience. When we are experiencing culture in an organizational context, at Mercer, we define culture as the operating environment that we're in. It's this collective set of, as you mentioned, values, behaviors, and basically how things are done around here, right, in an organization. And often, when a lot of organizations fail to understand the importance of culture, Often it's the organizational culture that permeates, that manages the organization, and it's often not what the organization's leaders would like it to be, right? So in the context of M&A, we found that culture risk, left to chance, will delay or derail the deal. We found 30% of transactions fail to meet financial targets due to culture issues. 2/3 of our survey respondents experienced delayed synergy realization due to culture issues. And almost half of our survey respondents cited an inadequate focus on people issues throughout the deal process as the primary drivers of shortfalls. So basically, the consequence of not addressing culture leads to productivity loss, customer disruption, flight of key talent, delayed synergies, right? And I think a lot of people intuitively understand this and know it, but still I find a lot of organizations fail to do anything about it. And I think this is where this concept of culture intelligence becomes really important, right? If you have leaders that have high cultural awareness, high cultural sensitivity, and understand that culture is actually a financial risk, not a non-financial one, that's when you have organizations paying more attention and trying to do something about it. One of the hardest things about culture is how does one actually go about measuring it, right? Catherine, when you opened, you mentioned people are inherently aware that different nationalities have different cultures, right? And some of it is stereotypical, others are not. But understanding national cultures is important. But in an M&A context or in a organizational context, understanding organizational culture is equally important. The fact is that you can have two organizations that are in the same country, right? Headquartered in the same country, that are in the same industry, that have vastly different cultures because they operate, based on very different principles, right? I look at the example of somebody like an Amazon versus a Walmart, right? Walmart's, operating environment and its entire business model is built on the fact that they can offer the lowest cost to customers. And that entire organization is built on that cultural tenet. On the other hand, Amazon's, culture is built around delighting the customer, right? We want to make sure that we make it as easy as possible for customers to shop at Amazon, right? And so their entire culture is built around the customer experience. Two very, very different ways of operating. So when we look at culture, we found that we need a way to measure, that culture from the executives, managers, and employees' perspective. And we've got to look at it through multiple lenses. We look at strategy. So how does the organization compete? We look at change. How does the organization adapt and evolve? And this has become more and more important, especially post-pandemic. People, how do people treat each other in an organization? And finally, operations, how does the organization get things done? And underlying this is our drivers, behaviors, outcomes, right? So let's say an organization wants to drive a culture of collaboration, right? They want to ultimately, increase revenues because that's how they generate shareholder wealth. So they want different lines of business to stop operating in silos, work together, and share, client bases or connections so that they can increase their cross line of business sales. Well, the behavior that they're trying to drive is collaboration, right, to achieve higher revenues. The drive in that case might be something like structure or incentives, right? If individuals are only incentivized to drive performance for their own business, then that's the way they're going to behave, right? Because that's how you are rewarding them. On the other hand, if you suddenly put half their pay, right, linked to how much sales they can generate for other lines of business, that's going to change behavior. So it's really important in any culture work that we understand it's really the employee behaviors that are going to define how work gets done. And in order to change culture or drive culture, we've got to define and use different levers to drive those collective set of behaviors. So in the M&A work that we've done at Mercer, we've learned a tremendous amount through both the research and the experiences we've had. And I want to just list out 6 common pain points that we've observed from prior projects, right? Number 1, culture refresh is a long-term journey, and it requires self-awareness and behavior change, right? There are no shortcuts to this. Typically we see it takes a couple of years, 2 to 3 years to change culture. Now, the quickest way to change culture is you change your entire leadership team, because we know that the leadership team is the one that primarily drives culture, but that's not feasible, right? So when a new leader comes in, or they have a new leadership team, to sustain that new organizational culture, they've got to drive it from the top. The second one that I often see is sometimes organizations agree and align on the vision, mission, values, but that does not mean that you're actually changing or aligning, the operating environment, right? You can have all the fanciest posters up, in your office walls. It doesn't mean that's the way people are going to behave if your incentives and your structures don't support those values. Very often we come across this, believing nothing will change or need to change. So we come across leaders that are so fixated on a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. They're used to doing things the way they've always done it, and they have blind spots, so they don't realize, that they are too, stuck in the old ways to change. So engaging leaders and identifying those that have these blind spots and are cynical about any culture change, I think is again an important area that needs to be worked on for any culture change project. A lack of senior management ownership. I speak to a lot of CHROs and HR function, leaders, and often HR is tasked with sort of a culture change initiative, right? Whether it's looking at all of the employee engagement surveys and using that information to make changes. But again, the reality is that if culture change is not endorsed and supported by the CEO and his senior leadership team, it is bound to fail, because people ultimately are going to look to leaders and how leaders behave, not what they say, to mimic, those behaviors. Communications alone will not drive change, right? So communications, I think, is an important part of any change process, but having direct conversations, creating shared stories, creating experiences for employees, identifying key stakeholders, all of those aspects of a change management process are equally important. And lastly, it takes time to sustain behavior change. One-time activities are not enough. We've seen through, again, experience that you need at the minimum a short-term 90-day plan with periodic nudges, right? To sustain behavior change. And then that has to be reinforced periodically, over the next few years to really hit the message home. I'd like to just, end with one quick story, right? So in my own personal journey, I moved to Asia 8 years ago. And I'm originally from Asia. I grew up in India. Throughout my time in the US, I worked in culturally diverse, multicultural teams. So when I moved here, I was pretty confident that I could, very easily navigate the new culture that I was immersing myself into. And in my first project meeting, I was working for a Japanese client. And, we had prepared a nice proposal based on the requirements. We had a meeting with the client, and we kind of, hashed out all of their requirements and how we would approach it. And I got, nods and agreement in the meeting. I came out thinking, wow, this was an easy meeting. They've agreed to everything that we asked for. And I had a Japanese colleague sitting with me, and he just laughed at me. He says, them nodding and agreeing in a meeting means nothing, right? They're going to go back and then figure out what they agreed to and not, and come back to us. But in the Japanese culture, it is not accepted or polite to disagree on your face in a meeting. And I was schooled, right? Like I realized I am in a completely different environment, and they don't teach you this in a textbook, right? So you've got to experience it to understand culture. So, hopefully this has been helpful, but I think what if there's one thing I'd like people to take away from this session is that when we think about culture, when we think about organizational culture, really what I like to do is replace that with operating environment. And it's all of those things: people, strategy, adaptability to change, and operations that really makes up an organization's culture. So we should not be fooled by just words on a wall and think that the organization operates a certain way based on nice posters. Thanks, Catherine. I'll hand this back to you now. I think you're still on mute.
Thank you very much, Drew, for this sharing. That leads us to our last panelist for today. So we have Professor Guido Giannasso. Professor Guido is a professor of leadership at HEC Paris in Qatar, a leadership and cultural intelligence expert. He's a Swiss-Italian national with 35 years of international management, teaching, and consulting experience. He wears many hats. He is also a visiting professor at the University of Geneva and the Wealth Management Institute in Singapore. He is the honorary consul of Romania in Geneva. He is an air transport and financial sector expert, a regular speaker at international conferences. He was the Associate Dean and Professor of Global Leadership at Nanyang Business School at NTU a few years ago. Prior moving to education sector, Professor Giannasso worked for 3 decades as a senior corporate executive. He was a CHRO and executive committee member in the aviation and security sectors. He has led major change programs, and he has worked with CEOs to conduct organizational turnarounds. More recently, Professor Guido has been a LinkedIn influencer, and he is here today to discuss some of his thoughts and reflections on several of his posts that have attracted several million views. One of them is Emma Raducanu and the Illusion of Nations. Since then, he has had several other posts. So he's going to come and share about his reflection on changing cultural and generational trends and what that means for businesses and societies in Singapore and beyond. Professor Giannasso, please. Welcome.
Thank you, Catherine. Your long introduction proves that I am an old man, right? My journey has been long. I'm delighted to be here with you today. It's a great topic, which is very close to my heart, but also it's in a way it's my home. Good to be back at NTU and see some familiar faces. So I don't have slides. I will tell you a little bit about my recent experiences and the importance of culture in our world and what I've been doing about it. So let me start from your comments on my posts, on my LinkedIn activities. I started posting a few years ago, and to my surprise, and of course I post basically only on two topics. One is leadership, the broader definition of leadership, and the other one is culture and cultural intelligence, right? And I try to use culture as a way to read the reality, not only the corporate world, but also what's happening in the real world out there, in the world of politics and international relations and so on. And I realized, to my surprise, that there is a lot of interest out there. My post about Emma was pointing to the fact that Emma is actually a very cosmopolitan person, as she has a Romanian father, a Chinese mother. She's born in Canada, grown up in the UK, and the very moment she won Wimbledon, she was kind of showed as a national champion by the Queen, by Romania, by China, by a number of countries that actually tend to practice quite defensive and ethnocentric policies. But when it's about owning the world champion, they forget everything. They forget Brexit, they forget their policies, and they consider Emma as their own, right? And that was fascinating. And that post attracted, as you say, almost 10 million viewers. And I received tens of thousands of messages and emails, including some very, very long emails that basically were coming from mixed families telling us, this is talking to us. I am Indian, and my husband is German, our children are grow up in London, we don't know what we are. And finally, we recognize ourselves in what you say. So that's one comment about culture. I also have used the cultural intelligence framework to look at what is currently happening between Russia, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And my point was, we can read the current event, the war, as a result of Putin's aggressive strategy, in economic terms, in geostrategic terms. And I propose a different reading, which is, it's actually about national culture. It's about how Russians, not all Russians, but how the large segment of the Russian society sees the world. It's a very high power distance, it's a very collectivistic, very nationalistic world. And what is happening there in Ukraine is not so much a result of Putin's personal views. It's to a large extent a product of the Russian society at large. And again, this post has received a lot of feedback, or 2 million views, and so on and so forth. So that's one point. Let me say in broader terms that what I've learned in my 37 years journey is that both in academia and in the corporate world is that there is an elephant in the room, and this is culture, right? Organizations in general know that they are facing cultural challenges. Of course, there is a corporate culture, and Drew was talking about it, challenge, but also there is a national dimension, which is very important. And there is a generational dimension because new generations today are significantly different from the older one, right? And that's particularly true in Asia, that's particularly true in the Gulf region where I work. Young Chinese, young Indians, young Qataris, young Saudis are very, very different from the parents. They are more individualistic, they are lower power distance, they have different values. They, in a way, they can be seen as a group with different cultural features. And this is a challenge. It's a challenge for governments, and it's a challenge for organizations, for corporate. It's a challenge for government everywhere, including my friends in Singapore, right? How can the government articulate policies that resonate with the older Singaporean generations, the pioneers, and with the new generation, which is significantly more individualistic and has different expectations? It's very difficult. The same is true in China. The same is true here in the Gulf. At the corporate level, the pain is there. I mean, Dhruv talked about it, how to manage teams that are very diverse, right? In many ways, including from a national cultural viewpoint and from a generational cultural viewpoint, how to do that. So a lot of my work recently has been as a consultant for corporations like ST Microelectronics, like Alstom, like HP corporations that are facing this challenge and finally try to tackle it. My consulting work in this area is typically around two objectives. Often organizations ask me to help senior managers handling cross-cultural teams. I very much remember my work with a senior executive in Singapore for a large French multinational, and the guy had been promoted to global head of procurement, and he suddenly, this is a Singaporean Chinese engineer who was suddenly given the responsibility of teams based in France, Italy, Malta, Morocco, and he had absolutely no clue on how to deal with Italians, how to deal with French. He was quite desperate about it. So what I was doing is helping him to understand, the French framework, the Italian cultural framework, the Moroccan cultural framework. So that's one intervention that it's quite often. Another major need in terms of CQ development is from companies who have outsourced IT capacity and platform to India, right? And you have this American, European senior leaders who suddenly have to handle a team of, real story, a team of 35 Indians based in India, right? And they have no clue, right? They have no clue, they don't understand, and they think they have given clear instructions, and then they are facing with reactions and feedback that they cannot really read. So a lot of my work has been about how to understand, right? And how to manage, lead credibly teams, particularly IT teams based in India. So these are two real cases. And it's fascinating to see how much need there is for leaders and executives in terms of develop their own understanding of other cultures and of course developing CQ across the organization. And then of course from the academic viewpoint, we have brought cultural intelligence. We have brought very much CQ and the culture in our executive MBA journey. And the feedback from our participants, particularly from participants from the Gulf region, where diversity is there, and it's a very important component of the executive life. They have been very, very enthusiastic about it, and it's passionate. They want to read, they want to study, they want to understand how other national groups, other generational groups think and feel, right? And just to close, I tell you, it's fascinating to see to which extent you can have different ethnical and different cultural groups in a place like Qatar or Saudi Arabia living together without knowing each other, right? In Qatar, there are 300,000 Qataris, there are 700,000 Indians, there are 200,000 Pakistanis, there are about 300,000 Filipinos. They live together, they work together, they talk, they communicate, but they don't know each other, right? And it's true on both sides. you have 700,000 Indians living here. Many of them are born in Qatar. They've gone to school in Qatar. Their children are born in Qatar. They don't speak one word in Arabic. And at the same time, which is something that you may say it can be learned by osmosis, right? If you live here, you should learn, but still it doesn't happen. And the same is true from the Qatari side. They live with Indians, their professors are Indians, their doctors are Indian, their drivers are Indians, and they don't have a clue of what India is about, the Indian society, the culture, the dynamics, nothing. So you see that there is an elephant in the room, and how much work is needed to bring to build cultural intelligence, mutual understanding in communities that live side by side without knowing each other. I stop here because I think it would be great if we can have some questions and a little bit of a debate. I don't know, Catherine, whether my message makes any sense here, but
Yes.
I hope it does.
Thank you very much, Guido. I think you are bringing some new important questions. It's like, culture is the elephant in the room. We all know it exists, but the question is, how do we deal with it? And you highlight some important point about how do you create policies and how do you deal with it when you already have within the culture, you already have like so many diverse and different groups, right? How to integrate all of this. So I think these are important points that you raised. And I see some questions have been posted already in the chat. So we are going to maybe address some of them. I wanted to start with a question that Iran has asked about employee activism. Iran, would you like to, maybe Ima is going to help you unmute and you can share your question directly to the panel.
Hi, thanks for the sharing. So my question is to Dhruv. It's because just now you mentioned that primarily senior management would be the one that drives company culture. But I think we see on the news that at least in the USA, there is increasing amount of employee activism. So these employees who may be in the minority or majority, we don't know, they actually are trying to drive the company in a certain direction to take certain positions or certain values. How do you see this impact on companies, at least maybe the USA?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jung. And I think it's this feedback loop has been a really important input to leadership, right, in driving culture. And I don't think it's just a US issue. I think it's happening globally. I think we've all heard of the Great Resignation, which I think is quickly being reframed as the Great Reshuffle, right? Employees ultimately have a vote, right? They can vote if they want to work for a company or not. And during the pandemic, we have found that employees have voted in large numbers, right? And moved away from organizations where they believe either the values or the purpose does not quite match with what they believe in, or it's driven companies to adopt a more flexible way of working, right? So employees are saying, hey, I can work anywhere now. I'm not stuck working for this organization because this is the only organization in my vicinity or neighborhood. I can work for an organization that aligns more closely with my values, right, and my purpose. And that organization may be 4 hours away, but I can sit here in my house and work for that organization. So I am going to do that. So it's an important feedback loop for leaders. And we found that leaders that were not smart enough to figure this out quickly were losing employees by the droves, right? So leaders do have to adapt. And the ones that have adapted more quickly, the organizations that have adapted more quickly, I think will ultimately win the war for talent. So maybe one of the other panelists wants to chime in here as well. I mean, just the one other thing is ESG, for instance, has become a huge agenda item on boards, goals, and the social aspect of ESG is one that's significantly driving changes in North America. So maybe Preet, you'd want to maybe address the, the DEI and the S aspect of ESG that's impacting organizations.
Yes, happy to, of course. And I agree with everything you've said. So I think when I think about employee activism, I guess that is what the employee resource groups or the business resource groups in the IND space are. So Twitter has 11 employee-led communities that are created. Some of them are on ethnic backgrounds. So that we have Blackbirds for the Black Twitter employees. We have Twitter Alas for the Latinx population. We have Twitter Asians. So there are different communities. And I think where we really amplify and give them space is that one, they should find community within Twitter. Yes, so be able to share their, their experiences and celebrate their cultures loudly and proudly within our company. But also there are external events that specifically impact these communities, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement, whether it is the Asian hate that we saw during the pandemic as well. So really also giving these employees the voice to say, what is my company going to do? How is my company going to show up in this moment? Whether it means, yes, partnering with our Twitter for Good branch, the philanthropy branch, and saying, okay, we can put our money towards communities that are driving the work in the very communities that are impacted. And our employee resource groups become a key way to bridge that. Or as I said, bringing thought leaders in and helping us understand how can we raise our own cultural intelligence and cultural awareness within the company and hear from, from them as to how we can show up as allies, but also more importantly, how can we create a culture of inclusion at all times. So I think, to me, employee activism comes out that way. It is absolutely top down to create the culture, but ultimately culture is also those interactive moments between people. It's not just the big programs and the benefits that get rolled out. So in those moments between people, are people feeling included or excluded? What was that experience like for that individual? That will speak to the culture, what kind of behaviors are tolerated and what kind of behaviors are swept under the rug. Those are the kind of moments that create, this is what this company's culture is all about. So I think the employee voice is absolutely necessary. Companies have to be able to create space to hear that voice, but then also it ultimately, as I said, it comes down to the leadership as well. What actions, what behaviors are being encouraged and what behaviors are being called out. I think all of that plays a huge role.
Thank you, Preet. For Guido, what are your insights on this idea of the impact of employee activism?
I pass on this one. I leave my colleague from the corporate world to drive the discussion.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. So we had another question by Christine. Christine was asking about the challenges of inclusive hiring. Christine, would you like to share your question directly to the panel?
Yeah. Hi, Preet. Yeah, thank you for the talk. I've had some experience in inclusive hiring. I was a manager for persons with autism. So some of the challenges I encountered was tokenism, when even hiring managers say, you just tell me how many to hire and then I will go and hire. Or even compromising on meritocracy, because I think meritocracy is important in Singapore. And even job scoping or progression, because when we scope the job a bit too narrowly for the person, then it might affect that person's prospects in moving elsewhere too. So I was interested to know more about the challenges Twitter has faced in inclusive hiring and how you have addressed them. How long has it taken training and talent development efforts, which you mentioned, to bear fruit? Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Christine. And I think it's a learning in progress. I don't think I can say it's done and dusted, but we started with the premise that I think it is a bias when people think that as you grow for diversity, that you need to give up anything on meritocracy, or you're lowering, quote unquote, the bar on meritocracy. I think that is a bias that needs to be addressed right off the bat. So when we talk about our inclusive hiring principle, there are 5 principles that we've laid out. And the number 1 principle is that we are hiring the most qualified individual for the job. So that is the premise that we're starting with. There is no discussion about the fact that we are lowering the bar or we now are going to make compromises for anybody that is less qualified. But then we continue to say what we're trying to do here is make sure that we've expanded the pool that we're hiring from to include the very communities that we know are historically excluded from some of the tech roles as well. So really making sure that that is understood. We're improving the quality and the quantity of the individuals that are coming to the pool. We're talking about making sure that inclusion and diversity principles are embedded in the entire hiring process. So addressing bias at the recruiting level with hiring managers, with teams, ensuring that when you even come for an interview, the panel that you put forward for an interview, is that really a diverse panel or not? So really these kinds of interventions are also necessary. It's not just about saying, I want to hire a woman, go and then you go and, you know, that would be tokenism that you hire the one woman, but rather having enough women in the pool to start with that are qualified for the role, embedding inclusion and diversity principles. So you have mitigated bias, you have mitigated the initial, you know, challenges that even come across to bring then the talent pool to the point where now you are selecting the most qualified individual for the role, who also perhaps happens to come from a diverse candidate pool in the first place. So it is going to take work to get us there. As far as talent management piece goes, I think that's where we, perhaps in some areas, have made more leeway than others. So for example, particularly around leadership development programs for women, I can definitely see that there are dedicated equitable programs, not just at Twitter, but in many different companies that really target, you know, what keeps women back, and addressing, yes, there are some, you know, internalized beliefs that limit ourselves down, but more than that, more than fixing the women, it's what needs to be fixed in the system, in the processes, in the programs. So really looking at that from that lens as well, and then taking a look at, you know, what needs to change for our programs, but also then what is the additional support that we can provide some of these underrepresented communities. Same thing we're doing for some of our leadership development programs for the Black community in the US, targeted programs to help them develop, to give them, and all it comes down to is that conversation around equity, right? We know not everyone has the same start in life. So now that there are Twitter, what can we do to build that one step that might have been broken for them somewhere else and make it happen here? So I think it's work in progress. For people with disability, I think that's a key area of focus for us as well. And I don't think we have come that far just yet. It is a constant discussion to realize that we currently represent, I think for the global population, we have about 3.3% that identify as a person with a disability. And we're looking at our metrics now to say, okay, well, what orgs are they sitting in? What levels are they at? Are there barriers to their advancement? And then our team can then bring in those interventions, as I mentioned. And it is in partnership with our Twitter Able community group, which is the voice of the employees with disability, to help us realize our gaps and then help us create the programs that we need to do. So I think bringing them in absolutely is necessary, and you need to do that the right way. That myth about lowering the bar or meritocracy takes a hit because you're improving for diversity, I think is a bias, and we need to call it out as such and do the work that is necessary to create inclusion. But then take a look, as you said, for that entire life cycle. It's not just about having a percentage in your company. Are you seeing them develop? Are they part of your leadership programs? Is your leadership encouraged to learn about their experiences? Are you building with inclusion and diversity in mind, whatever your company might be doing? All of that pieces are still very much a work in progress. But thank you for the question.
If I may, Catherine, using the card that I didn't use on the previous question, on Christine's question, I agree on what Preet was saying. Whether we like it or not, Christine, I strongly believe it that we need mechanisms. We need to work on it. We need quotas or targets. You can use different tools, right? But if you don't, the progress will be very, very slow. And if you look at whether at the employee level or at the board level, countries and companies that have made significant progress are those where there are incentives, where there are quotas, where there are targets, where there are mechanisms in place. Because the reality, you know, the just like me bias is very strong. We like it or not, senior leaders, board members, CEOs like to hire people who are like them, right? So we really need mechanisms. If you look at what France has done, is quite remarkable. Even Malaysia is ahead of Singapore when it comes to gender diversity and so on. Why? Because they have a legislation in place. It's not perfect, right? It's definitely not perfect. There are some problems. There are some collateral damages, but fundamentally, you need mechanisms in place. And you know, you will hear, you will always hear, "We lower the bar." You will always hear resistance and skepticism and cynicism. Just ignore it and move ahead, right? This is the price we need to pay. We need to be reasonable when we talk about quota and mechanism. Of course, you cannot ideologically decide that from tomorrow 50% of all promotions will be women. That's not realistic. You have to build a talent pool which supports, right, promotions and career development decisions. So you have to be reasonable. You have to be intelligent. It's a journey, right? It doesn't happen overnight, but you have to push and encourage leaders at all levels to start the journey.
Thank you very much. So I do have one last question I wanted to ask the panel, and I will post it here. So and this is a question that some people have asked me before, is if cultural intelligence is so important, why is it that we don't hear about it more? You all of you three have mentioned about this as an important, capability. So in your view, what is it what are some reasons why we don't hear about it more? And, yes.
Yeah.
Drew.
Sorry, Catherine. I think in my experience, one of the things that I've observed, so when I was early in my own sort of leadership journey, I found that companies actually did invest quite a bit in leadership development. And I think cultural awareness and cultural intelligence was definitely a core part of that development. What I've found, and I've validated this with a lot of, CHROs or heads of learning that I've spoken to, there's been less of an emphasis on that mid-level management development and training in the last 5-6 years. So we've lost some of it. I am seeing now post-pandemic refocus on this area. The global financial crisis was the crisis for the CFOs to shine, or the chief risk officers, and I found that the pandemic has been the opportunity for CHROs, and there has been a renewed, I think, interest in helping develop people because there's been such a disruption in the people agenda. So I'm actually optimistic that the concept of cultural intelligence and organizations recognizing the importance of it is, I think, much more on the agendas of leadership teams than it was 3-4 years ago.
Catherine, I have a pretty strong view on this one. Based on my interaction with CEOs, I think there are 4 categories of CEOs, 4 groups. There are the CEOs who do not see the problem. They really don't see the problem. There are the CEOs who see the problem, but don't know what to do with it, right? How do I handle, right? What concretely can I do to develop cultural intelligence? There are those who know the problem, maybe have some ideas about how to handle it, but don't want to handle, because bringing diversity in organizations means somehow, rocking the boat, the disrupting this very nice old boys club that has worked so well for so long, right? Having the possibility to appoint, promote, and hire people who are just like me, right? And then there are those who know the problem, want to address it, and have seen, understood how to do it. But unfortunately, this fourth group is still relatively small. Still relatively small. I don't know whether it's 20%, 25%, but definitely not more than 1/3 of the overall CEOs community, right? So our job here is trying to create a sense of urgency, but more importantly, to give concrete solutions, right? We have a problem in academia, Catherine, which is we are very good in identifying the problem. We are very good in developing conceptual frameworks. But how do we bring this conceptual, how do we translate this conceptual framework into reality, action, development program, mechanisms, structures, platforms that can help organizations, right? So our job is helping organizations in the end, right? And if we don't do that, we will continue to be in the same situation as we are now, 10 years down the road.
Great. Thank you, Prof. Guido. Preet, would you like to pitch in?
I think I see the conversations a lot, to be honest, or maybe because of the work that I do, we ensure that these conversations happen. And I think in my own lived experience as well, like I remember even growing up in Canada, and when I first started working, like you're meeting people with so many different cultural backgrounds, and you know, maybe there weren't structured conversations, but there was definitely a lot of interaction happening in the workplace and people sharing and proudly sharing, you know, cultural celebrations, or at least companies creating that space for it. I think the conversations about how that moves into talent management now, and especially, like I said, the nuances in the region here, you know, are we really, is there a bias against Asian talent from Asia versus Asian talent in the US? Is there a bias from, you know, in the tech industry towards like even the caste conversation that's rearing its, you know, its truth in the US now. So I think it is definitely top of mind. Companies are putting a lot of effort in building that leadership capability to say, to be a global team, you have to have some understanding of how to work around global cultures. There are dedicated tools that companies can use, but ultimately, yeah, I agree. I think it is, what does the company stand for? Is this part and parcel of who you are as a company? Is it embedded in your cultural values to learn about different cultures and create space for learnings and staying away from bias and stereotypes? I think companies that are doing the work, I think, are definitely talking about it, but some companies also prefer, okay, we're only going to focus on women. That's what we feel we can measure. It's a tangible result that we can see, and they go after that. So I think it really depends on which route the companies are willing to take, where they're willing to put their resources. But I know more often, perhaps than not, these discussions are definitely mainstream.
Wonderful.
One thing I will add, Catherine, is
Yes,
that the one concern I do have is that with the rise of nationalism and it becoming more hard for talent to cross borders or work in other countries, or even companies to promote that, I do see a risk. For me personally, I think the best way to build cultural intelligence is to actually immerse yourself in a new culture and work in that environment. Again, things that you just don't learn, you know, through the academic frameworks and books, right? And if countries keep pushing the nationalistic agendas and closed borders, that is definitely a big risk for building cultural intelligence. So I just wanted to add that, supporting Guido's point, I think.
Yeah, that's a good
Catherine,
yeah.
Catherine, may I throw a little bomb in the room just to make sure that we
I don't want to stretch it too far. I know we're already 5 minutes ahead, like over time. So can you make it quick?
All right, I will try to make it quick. And it's a message to Preet. I mean, we have to keep the work that many American US corporations are doing in this area is remarkable and very interesting. However, I have the feeling that unfortunately sometimes we stick to the visible definition of diversity, right? We talk about women and minorities, and that's the visible part. the real issue and challenge is going to the third level, which is the level of shared assumptions, right? This is where the real battle is. Having the ability and the courage to look not only for people who are different in terms of the color, the gender, or the sexual orientation, but different in terms of cultural assumptions, shared values, right? Because you may be Afro-American, but totally US from a cultural viewpoint, right? So the real question for me is going to level 3, and that's an additional challenge for all of us and for corporations.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Prof. Guido. Thank you, Preet. Thank you, Dhruv. So we covered quite a bit of ground today. I noted just a few points that came through your discussions. This idea of creating space for people to learn, that is one thing that Preet mentioned that is done at Twitter. This point that Dhruv made, that culture is about behaviors, understanding the drivers so you can influence the behavior and the outcomes. This is another important point. And Prof. Guido has mentioned about culture, the elephant in the room. You also mentioned that when we ask, what can we do? How do we move this conversation about cultural intelligence forward? Is this idea of looking for solutions, providing more solutions, how to make culture more tangible and cultural intelligence more practical. I think one thing that Preet has said that is giving a sense of hope is that, yes, there is interest and the companies are talking about it. Dhruv is saying that, because of the pandemic and the changes that has happened and the disruptions, there is now a focus on developing leaders to make them more culturally intelligent. But at the end of the day, it's really about experiences, those differences, experiencing the different cultures to understand really, truly the shared assumptions, like what Prof. Guido has mentioned. So I want to thank all 3 of you for joining in this panel today. It was very enlightening and enriching to hear your different perspectives and views. I am mindful of the time, so we would like to end these sessions soon. But Prof. Yogesh wanted to just say a few words for those of you who want to stay back about our programs here at the Nanyang Fellow MBA program. Prof. Yogesh, I'm going to share my screen and you can introduce your.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, look, firstly, huge thanks to our excellent panelists, Dhruv, Preet and Guido. That was a great discussion. And thanks to you, Catherine, for organizing this. Very briefly, the genesis of this panel was the idea you and I had about bringing in real world practitioners of CQ and from industry. And that's exactly what we've had, a great kind of insight as to kind of the application of these principles and ideas. It's an important topic, so we've opened it up beyond the Nanyang Fellows, and so we've had others participating. I was going to take a couple of minutes to introduce the program, but in the interest of time, I'll just say this is a leading 1-year, now also 2-year part-time MBA program focused on mid-senior public sector talent. It was envisaged and launched about a quarter of a century ago by the then Deputy Prime Minister Tony Tan. The idea was to nurture future-ready and transformative leaders, both through our curriculum, but also through creating strong networks of leaders across the region. So I won't say very much more. We partner with Tsinghua and Berkeley, so we bring in the best of the East and the West. But for those interested in learning more about the program, please look at the links and the QR code, and I'll end with thanking again the speakers and you as the moderator, and I'll say watch this space for future Nanyang Fellow events in this kind of mold. Thanks everyone, and let's show our appreciation in the usual way to the speakers. Okay, goodbye all.
Thank you.